Well, Geoff, how's it going?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks so much for coming on. Um,
Not at all.
I'd like to jump right into it. Could you just give us kind of a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Sure. So my bio is pretty much I did my PhD in the late 2000s into the early 2010s, finishing in 2012. I was studying comparative literature. Prior to that, I should say I was also in between college and grad school. I was living abroad, mostly in Latin America. So a lot of the work I did in grad school was kind of focused on Latin America, even though I don't write extensively about um, that particular topic anymore so much. And yeah, basically, I did a PhD in comparative literature. I was working on a pretty wide range of material, and I had struggled with specialization. I was just interested in trying to cover as many periods as and kind of different literatures and languages as I could manage. But I primarily, in the end, focused my research on late 19th and early 20th century, predominantly European and Latin American fiction, and also psychoanalytic theory and the history of psychiatry. So those are kind of the intersections of it. Um, and my focus at that time was heavily on like the history of the concept of paranoia and its representation in literature. So that, I should say, was kind of one of the things that kind of laid the groundwork for some other somewhat distinct work I would do later and more recently. But in any case, beyond that, I went to eventually went to NYU to teach in the undergraduate writing program. So I'm basically teaching sort of writing and humanities seminars to undergrads in various different schools of NYU, and I've been doing that 7 8 years now. And I because of the sort of particular path I took, I had a lot of freedom in terms of the kinds of things I could write. I wasn't on a sort of since I'm on essentially a teaching track rather than a research track, that has certain disadvantages, but it also has some freedom attached to it. So I started writing. I published in academic peer-reviewed journals, but I started trying to write for a more general public. And I started writing particularly about technology and internet culture and things like that. And so that was, we're still in the sort of first half of the 2010s here. And basically from there, I kind of went. I mean, one thing I started doing was taking these ideas about the history of paranoia and its representation in literature and culture, to kind of think about contemporary like conspiracy cultures online and the sort of weird manifestations of paranoia in internet culture, and also the different way that it was kind of being talked about. So that was sort of one of the threads that I started to pursue that kind of came out of my doctoral research, but then I kind of recalibrated it to focus on some strange internet subcultures and things like that. So I was doing more kind of just observing how these subcultures were functioning and trying to make sense of them using some of the tools I had. Then the other thing that happened was one of the theorists I was sort of interested in grad school was Rene Girard. And so sometime, because I was spending a lot of time kind of observing internet dynamics in this period, I kind of went back to his theories and started thinking about the way that they were useful for trying to account for what was happening in these kind of new online spaces. And so that was kind of another thread that I picked up that sort of came out of that research that I had done and reading I had done in grad school, but that I was kind of trying to apply to a totally different domain. Um, and so I started writing about Girard and his kind of relationship to social media dynamics. And that was sort of that initiated a project that I'm sort of still working on, and I'm, currently teaching a course about Girards. So, that's something I've been thinking about ever since. This is going back to about 2015. And then I suppose kind of coming out of that, the other thing that I started noticing was just there was a lot of, that there are all these sort of theory wars and sort of earlier iterations of the culture war that involve these kind of, Girard was sort of an anti-postmodernist in a sense, but he was also, he had relationships with some of these figures like Derrida, and he actually was instrumental in bringing some of them when he was a professor at Johns Hopkins over to the U.S. in the late 60s. So, he had a kind of complicated relationship to all these other kind of French, social and cultural theorists. And so I started thinking about these other odd links to contemporary internet culture and dynamics that I was starting to see. And so I started kind of revisiting a lot of these sort of canonical texts of what's usually called postmodern theory, and thinking about, how they might be helpful in understanding internet culture, but also how it might be helpful in looking back at them and making sense of what they were trying to do and kind of gaining a new perspective. So pretty much I'd say those are kind of the three projects, more or less. The conspiracy theory, online cultures of paranoia project, the sort of Girard online dynamics scapegoating project, and then the third is kind of revisiting this sort of canonical body of cultural theory that's suddenly that was very controversial in the 80s and 90s and is sort of controversial again. So I think the perspective I'm offering on it is pretty different from what most people who are talking about it today are offering, at least in the sort of popular sphere. So those are pretty much the three projects I've developed. And again, this probably has to do with being somewhat on the margins of academia. Like I teach, but I don't really do, academic research in the sense of peer-reviewed research much anymore. So I'm just trying to write for, a range of more popular audiences rather than sort of specialized niches within academia, which goes back to my resistance to specialization in the first place. But anyway, so that's probably enough said.
Nice. Yeah. And so, I'm sitting here in Durham, North Carolina, and Girard actually got one of his first academic positions at Duke, like 2 miles from me right now, which I think about that a lot. And he wrote one of his first books here as well. What are some of the most important things about Girard's theory that, if someone like you're going to try and give an elevator pitch on like what he kind of worked on and pioneered, what would you tell somebody?
Mm-hmm. So I'll try to do it sort of narratively, since this is narratives.
Yeah.
So he begins by working very closely with literature from primarily the 19th into the early 20th century, which was kind of the period that I was most interested in too in graduate school. And he discovers what he sees as a kind of operative principle that is shared across a wide array of texts, which is that you can observe these authors kind of documenting the way that their characters come to desire certain things, right? Which is that they come to desire certain things by essentially copying or imitating the desires of others, right? And so he sort of took literature as a source of revelation about a fundamental social dynamic, right? And particularly, he took a certain lineage of novelists who were capable of kind of seeing through the illusions that people create for themselves about why they want things, and revealing that by and large, the source of their desires is imitated. It's based on copying others. And then all of these other phenomena that are associated a lot with 19th century, particularly French literature, like, this concept of snobbery, vanity, that this is all tied up with. And so all these novelists were kind of sociologists, right? And they were observing contemporary society. And the part of the important thing here is that they were observing that as societies became more egalitarian, in other words, as traditional hierarchies were sort of waning, and there was greater possibility of social mobility, that did create certain new crises, because while it ostensibly allowed a kind of freedom, it also meant that, whereas to be schematic in a more traditional society, you would sort of, if you wanted to decide, or if you wouldn't really have to decide what you're going to do with your life, because you probably just do the same thing your father did and your grandfather did and so on, right? And so you didn't have to, you just looked up at some preordained model, right, which was probably your father or some elder person in your community, and you copied what they did. Whereas when we have more freedom, we can look around and we have more freedom to choose who our models are, right? So then the problem becomes, who do we copy our desires from, right? Well, and then the problem is, as anybody who's like been an ambitious person in a city or something like that, even today, when you're part of a group of people who are all copying their desires from the same models, then you're going to come into conflict, right?
Because everybody can't have the same thing.
Right. And so there's going to be an intense competitiveness. And so Girard notes that this is, a great theme of 19th century literature that doesn't necessarily have to do with, it often has less to do with the desire for basic material sustenance than to do with this idea that, your whole sense of who you are comes from this sort of dynamic, right? That you don't actually care so much about, and in fact, you'll give up material comfort just in order to be able to achieve what your model is achieving in some way. So this is this kind of this special sort of modern urban worlds that these novels document, and that Girard sort of saw them gradually revealing to us, right? And that these dynamics, when he was writing this in the 60s, continued up to that time. So from this, he derives the principle that conflict comes not from difference, but from similarity, right? Specifically, if we all want the same things, then we're going to come into conflict over those things. So, and then, the big leap in his career is basically between his first book, which is the one I was just describing, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, and his second book, Violence and the Sacred, right? And so Violence and the Sacred, he shifts his focus back millennia, right, to archaic societies as they're documented essentially in myth, but also in the biblical texts and other surviving documents, as well as the contemporary accounts of anthropologists of more traditional or archaic societies that subsisted into the modern era. And basically, he looks for the same pattern, right, which is this situation in which people come into conflict because they want the same things, because they're too similar. And he finds that, this is also a kind of crisis that's described in myths, right? So the similarity here is that he's going to these texts and he's finding a particular pattern that they document and describe. But here he comes to his next sort of major discovery, right, which is that the way that this crisis appears to be solved is through scapegoating, right? In other words, if you have a group of people who are all essentially in conflict and in this position of kind of oppressive sameness, right, which he calls, the sort of conflict between doubles, right? Then what eventually happens is that one person who slightly stands out within this group of people in conflict is selected as a sort of victim, and that they can all come together and sort of discharge the violence that they're
kind of built up,
exercising against each other, against this surrogate victim, right, who's then killed or expelled from the community, and this provides a kind of temporary pacification. So this is the second, the first idea is that human conflict comes out of sameness. The second is that this kind of conflict can be resolved through a reestablishment of difference, which takes the form of scapegoating, right? Of the entire group coming together around the scapegoating of an individual and achieving a kind of internal harmony by expelling this disparate element to the outside, right? Which creates a kind of boundary, which is the sort of beginning of a new order. Gotcha. So that's that's really kind of the second major discovery, right? And then the third one, which kind of comes in the next book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, is that there's a singular event, Girard argues, in human history, which is the essentially the crucifixion of Jesus, right? And the significance of this event is that it is not that it differs in any way from all of these other kind of sacrificial killings that have occurred over the course of history, but that that the way it is experienced and interpreted, because of the teachings that come out of first Jewish scriptures and then Jesus's teachings themselves, essentially enable for this mechanism. I mean, I'm missing I sort of missed a step here, which is that in order for this pacification function to work, the people must believe that the scapegoat is guilty of the sort of crimes that have.
But the witch really did
exactly.
bring the plague into the community or something like that.
Exactly, right. So you can think of witch hunting, all the crazy things that witches are accused of, right? Bringing plague, destroying crops, et cetera, et cetera. These things have to be genuinely believed. In other words, the guilt of the witch or scapegoat has to be accepted by the community in order for the pacification to work, right? And so the idea essentially is that gradually there's a kind of slow undermining of this, which begins in the Jewish, in the Hebrew Bible, right, in the texts of Jewish scriptures, and then sort of culminates in the moment of the crucifixion, which does not end scapegoating, but begins to weaken its efficacy by making it impossible to believe in the guilt of the scapegoat. And so those are, I'd say, kind of the three stages of the thought. And then he has a number of other books that kind of develop these ideas further. But to me, those are kind of the crucial moments of his discovery. I realized that was longer than an elevator pitch, but
no, well, it's complex, right? I mean, if it's not exactly things that can be easily condensed. I want to go back and talk about imitation a little bit. And how important do you think imitation is to human beings? I always remember this study I read, and it was with pigeons and the Monty Hall problem. And pigeons are oftentimes, they're better than a lot of humans at solving this like pure like rational optimization problem. And so I often think like perhaps humans' distinct advantage is our ability to copy what works, what other humans are doing. And I see Girard's work as like highlighting that and then reminding us that there can be some very dark things that come along with that.
Yeah. So, one thing that's important to specify in terms of Girard's thought is that, he comes there's a great deal of work on imitation and its significance to sort of human behavior prior to him.
Yeah.
So what he introduces is this idea of imitative or mimetic desire, right?
That's where the desire comes from.
That it's not merely that we see a behavior and copy it, which we do, obviously, as do many other animals. But we also see particularly someone acquiring or attempting to acquire something, and that triggers in us a desire for the same object, right? So, I think part of his argument is that this is intrinsically a difficult thing to observe in one's own life, because one is in various ways under all sorts of pressure to conceal this from everyone else and from oneself, right? You never want to be seen as someone who is pursuing a path simply because somebody else has done it first. And so, there are all these kind of strategies of denial or obfuscation, right? But I think, the idea here is that this is both a crucial element in shaping, our life path, and also one that is, for various reasons, difficult for us to observe or be willing to admit. At some point, Girard says that, modern, and he's thinking about Freud here, modern people become so obsessed with kind of detecting sexual impulses and everything, because they're still not willing to detect mimetic or imitative impulses, right? That sex becomes a way it becomes a way of essentially covering up the imitative nature of desire by still asserting that it's fundamentally the actual desirability of the object that makes it attract us, rather than this mechanism of mere imitation, right? So I think, I do think I think there are complications and reasonable critiques to be made about particularly what becomes difficult to explain is how, and this kind of goes back to the original example I brought up of like people in modern society who don't have they're not going to do exactly what their father did or their parents did. They're going to potentially strike out and do something else. So what is it that causes them to select one model for their desire rather than another? Like what accounts for that selection process? It seems clear that this happens, right? That people select models, or what Girard calls mediators. One thing that his theory maybe doesn't fully account for is how that selection process works. In other words, why does one person become my model rather than another? So I think there's still there are sort of areas of his thinking that I would say needs to be filled in more, perhaps. But overall, I think it's true that it is and remains a sort of neglected phenomenon, despite the fact that it's also so easy to observe. But it's part of the problem is that it's very easy to observe. Like many things, it's very easy to observe in others, but harder to be willing to admit in ourselves.
Definitely, absolutely. And do you feel you mentioned this earlier? Do you feel it has changed over time where, is it like a post-industrial revolution thing where suddenly you have a lot more freedom, you're living in a democracy, you've got, things are changing much more rapidly. It's not this society is much less static than it was in the past in feudalism where, like you said, you really have no options. Do you think this problem has gotten worse over time because of that?
I think there are a few different ways to respond to this. On one hand, so Girard would argue that, traditional societies, pre-modern societies, in various ways, expended a great deal of energy in regulating desire, right, and telling you what you could and couldn't desire, right. So, for example, and here's if you think of the 10 Commandments, right. Several of them have to do with, thou shalt not covet. They have to do with telling you should not desire something that belongs to another person, right? So that suggests, okay, this is a problem, right? That society needed to figure out how to solve,
right?
And so similarly, in many, just another simple example, think of the concept of the Sumptuary Code, right? That basically in many more traditional or earlier societies, there were actual rules about, depending on what your social station was, what you could wear and what you couldn't wear. There were processes of there were rules to decide who you could marry and who you couldn't marry, and things like that. So there were all sorts of ways that societies focused a huge amount of energy in restricting what people were allowed to have, and thus kind of regulating their desires, right? And so one way to interpret this is that the potential for conflict was always there because the mimetic impulse was always there, right? But these societies developed these relatively robust systems of prohibitions
to prevent that from happening.
That were supposed to prevent that from happening. And so these seem bizarre and irrational to us in modern times, right? Why are these things prohibited? Right? We think that's an affront to freedom and individuality and so on. So, I think part of the point with Girard is to kind of, you have to recognize the wisdom that's actually embodied in those sorts of regulatory systems, while at the same time not being a sort of conservative nostalgist in the sense of thinking that it's something that you can actually go back to. And I get into why he doesn't think that's a feasible thing. But whereas in modern times, what happens? Well, in a sense, there's this kind of free for all, right? Where suddenly people can supposedly pursue whatever they want. But of course, part of Girard's argument is that the freedom is illusory, right? Because we become enslaved to whatever model we appoint for themselves, right? And so, I think his account, his readings of like novelists like Proust and Dostoevsky are particularly good at illustrating this, right? You have these basically, these sort of urbane, cosmopolitan people with more or less limitless resources, living this life of apparent freedom, and yet they're constantly in this state of a sort of bizarre mental and spiritual servitude to other people who they've sort of appointed as the people who kind of determine the path of their desires, right? But then, the other thing that I think we could get into here is things like consumerism. I mean, obviously, what happens later? Well, basically, we have these massive, sort of apparatuses of propaganda, of advertising that are sort of
Right.
trying to direct our desires in particular directions, right? And are also, are essentially operating from this principle, right? The basic idea that you make a product desirable by showing somebody appealing who is consuming it or enjoying it, right? And so, there's a way that this freedom is actually illusory because there are all sorts of new mechanisms that come in and in a less overt and more subtle way kind of direct the course of our desires. So I think the point would be that the basic principle is there, but the way that modern society deals with it is somewhat different and more volatile.
Gotcha.
But and more complex, perhaps, but nevertheless is not, is by no means as free as it actually appears.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I've got a question, and this is a meta level question, and I've wondered this for a while. And it's slightly unrelated, but it is related. The pre-modern, modern, postmodern distinction. Does that describe something? What does that describe? And does that describe something real?
That's a really good question. So I struggle with this. One of the books that most kind of transformed my perspective at a certain time in my life was Bruno Latour's "We Have Never Been Modern," right? Which is probably the most influential book, arguing that there's a basic problem with that distinction, right?
Gotcha.
But the way that he does it is a bit more complicated, which is that he argues that what appears to distinguish modernity from pre-modernity is something that he calls the modern constitution, which we might think of as a kind of a way of describing something like secularism.
Gotcha.
And basically, the idea of the modern constitution in Latour's account is that you separate out nature and society, right? And you see nature as a separate entity that requires natural explanations, and society is a separate entity that requires social explanations. So pre-modern societies generally do not make this distinction, right? This is why they believe that earthquakes can be caused by, a person's immoral behavior, or, tend to believe that certain things that we consider natural phenomena actually have deep roots in human activities, or potentially, or vice versa, right? That they don't really separate these things out. So modern society enables the growth, particularly the growth of science, right? By taking nature and saying, if there's an earthquake or a flood, this is not caused by some human activity, right? Instead, it's something that has some natural cause, right? And therefore, we have to understand the systemic functioning of nature in order to explain it, right?
Got it.
So Latour says the problem. So this all seems pretty straightforward. It seems like the moderns were right? We were right to say nature is over here, society is over here, never the twain shall meet. So Latour actually says, no, this isn't true, right? Why isn't it true? Well, because if you think about all of the major trends that we consider today as the crucial ones, they completely defy this divisibility. If you take something like global warming, if you even take something, I mean, and he was writing this in, I think, the 90s, but, take something like COVID, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, even if the lab, if the lab leak hypothesis were true, then it would be a perfect illustration of this, right? That we can't really separate these two things anymore.
Yeah.
But even if it's not, the fact that COVID spread in the way that it did was entirely the result of the way that we've organized human society, right? So the point is, his argument was that this division was always was useful in the sense of enabling a kind of productivity on the part of science, but it was also illusory in some ways because it doesn't allow for the kind of thinking that will actually help us engage with the problems we face today. So one way of doing this division in the Latourian way would be to say we have the pre-modern, which is before we have the modern constitution, the strict division between the social and the natural. Then we have the modern, which is where we do have the strict division between the social and the natural. And then finally, we have the postmodern, which is where these things start to blur again, right? And it seems, and people start talking about things like the Anthropocene, right? Now, I want to say this is also, there's a way of talking about this in a Girardian way, right? Because if you think about, let's take the witchcraft example, right? So Girard argues that, typically we imagine, why did people stop burning witches, in about 350 years ago? Well, the typical answer is, well, they started learning how nature really worked, and therefore they realized that, crops weren't failing because of some hocus pocus. They were failing because of some, natural blight or something of that sort. So, so that's, that would be the sort of modern constitution moment, right? But so Girard has a different explanation of this, which is that, and perhaps a different explanation of where this modern constitution comes from, which is that, and this, if you can, for me, another influential figure is the anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard, who Girard works, who Girard is influenced by, who, has this notion that witchcraft is an explanation of unfortunate events. What does that mean? Well, basically cultures, which are basically all cultures and almost all, basically throughout human history, different cultures have had a concept of witchcraft, right? Which is basically, there's some person who is an agent of some misfortune, and that misfortune takes the form of some kind of supernatural intervention in the course of events, and that event and that intervention causes some disaster to befall the community, right? And so this is simply a way of saying different societies throughout history have had the kind of beliefs that are necessary to sustain the practice of scapegoating, right? That, in other words, they've had the kind of beliefs that enable them to say, oh, if there's some disaster befalling us, there must be somebody to blame. If we get rid of that person, we might not make the crop failure end right away, but at least we can relieve some of the social tensions around it, right? So Girard says basically there's a kind of gradual disabling of the scapegoat mechanism. So people stop believing in the guilt of the witch for the crop failure or whatever. And so his argument is that in order to have the direct investigation into natural causes, right? You first have to have the disabling of the scapegoat mechanism so that people say, okay, I guess that kind of explanation doesn't really work anymore. So we need to look for other kinds of explanations, right? So in this case, there's a way of reading the postmodern, which, I would say is not, and I would say neither of these ways of reading the postmodern are necessarily the ways that it's typically thought about, but they're, except that, it has to do with the waning of modern convictions in scientific progress and things like that, right? That in this case, along with the postmodern, you would have a weakening of these functions that held back the scapegoat mechanism, right? Which would potentially allow for it to proliferate in new ways, which I would say it pretty much has. So
nice.
Yeah.
Well put. Yeah, I think that distinction makes a lot of sense. And going back, so for Girard, Christianity is special. And and it's special because Jesus is truly innocent, and maybe there's some stuff in the Old Testament that also is a precursor to this. What do you think about that? Do you think it really is the Christian myth does stand discrete from other earlier myths and myths beyond Christianity?
So I think he makes a persuasive case in some places, and I think it does allow you to see. It essentially allows for a certain kind of exceptionalism that I think is descriptive rather than evaluative. In other words, that doesn't really set apart the parts of the world influenced by sort of Judeo-Christian scriptures as morally superior, but does set them apart as having initiated and gone through a kind of process, right? Which is the sort of discrediting of scapegoating first, right?
Yeah.
And that was historically causative and significant, right? And that what we're seeing today is the gradual kind of unfolding of that same process throughout the world, right? Through the creation of a kind of globalized monoculture, right?
Right.
So, I mean, in that sense, I think there is a persuasive case. I would say that what a weakness of his theory is that there is this whole notion of like the axial age, and you have these remarkable parallel developments in different cultures, right? Where there's generally and much of this involves a kind of movement away from sacrifice, right? Which is the sort of ritualized, substitute of the scapegoat mechanism in kind of more, advanced sort of priestly societies, right? So I think what's interesting to me is that there's clearly a kind of process of evolution that occurs in some cultures, particularly initially completely separately from the trajectory of Christianity. And so I would be interested to know, or I would be interested to understand better. And again, I think this is a part of his theory that he does have a late short book that's dealing with some Hindu texts, a book called Sacrifice from, I think, about 2010. So it was one of his last writings. But overall, I think this is an area that deserves further exploration, because the question is what causes that kind of coevolution of various cultures,
right?
Because we can see that there was a coevolution. I mean, certainly in the earlier period, the Girardian account would allow us to see how there's a spontaneous and emergent process by which different societies develop these kind of priestly sacrificial cultures, right?
Right.
And so it seems to me there's also a coevolution of various societies away from that, right? And particularly towards a kind of gradual moral repudiation of sacrifice. And so I'd be curious to, to me, that would be, if not at odds with Girard's kind of understanding of the uniqueness of Christianity necessarily, it would at least raise a question about whether we can really understand Christianity as the single kind of causal agent of this discrediting of sacrifice.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense, and an area perhaps to study further. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. And unfortunately it's one of these things it's like so ambitious that nobody does nobody does this kind of stuff anymore. I mean,
right.
So I guess it falls to, crazy outsiders and people like that who I'm interested in to try to do it, because people in academia aren't going to do that, right? Because again, it goes back to the specialization thing.
Right.
You need people who are just insanely ambitious and willing to go way out on a limb to try to think about these kinds of phenomena.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and even I think Girard even talks about this. It's like some interview for Canadian public television he did. It's like 4 hours long. I really enjoyed it. Listened to it on a plane recently. But he talks about how everyone just, all the academics were just unwilling to, look outside their specific subdomain, primarily because the incentives are they're not tuned in the correct way for you to be able to do that. Like, if to get tenure, you need to publish in X journals in your field, and you're not going to do that if you're doing these weird kind of very generalist or like sub kind of domain areas of research or exploration.
Yeah, and this goes back to my sort of chafing against specialization when I was in graduate school. So
right.
Yeah. I mean, this is part of what drew me to someone like Girard. It's just I appreciate somebody who has that kind of ambition.
Definitely.
And total defiance of any kind of expectations. I mean, I think there was a greater, it's interesting to read about his career in like Cynthia Haven's biography of him, because, there was a greater leeway and freedom in American academia at that time to really go out on a limb and undertake really ambitious theoretical projects that I just don't think exists anymore. So
yeah, I definitely think I haven't looked at it on the humanities side, but have you ever heard of Don Braben?
Mm-mm.
He's a really interesting guy. He's like 85 now, but he wrote a book called Scientific Freedom that was recently republished by Stripe Press. But his whole thought is that it used to be until recently, you could go and you could be a scientist or a scholar and you could get, $30K a year and you could just make it and study whatever you really wanted to. And now it's the opposite, where, you have to apply for grants. It's much more bureaucratic, and that kind of weeds out a lot of like the weird, wacky ideas, like, working on Max Planck working on thermodynamics for 20 years would just not be feasible in the same sense as it was back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another person who's written about this, who I was just thinking about, because I think it sort of ties into some things I was just talking about. David Graeber's Debt.
Oh, interesting.
The first 5,000 years, because it is kind of one of these, it's about a 5,000 year span of history. So that's ambition. But I mean,
ambitious.
He also wrote about the same kind of thing, how, just the way that academia is now governed by these kind of short-term incentives has really killed the possibility of undertaking a lot of that sort of more ambitious and out there research. And he sort of attributes the stagnation of intellectual life, kind of across the board to that situation. So yeah, I think that's a serious issue today. I mean, I think my only slight glimmer of hope is that there are just a lot of people doing weird and interesting stuff on the internet. So
yeah,
that's kind of and also I think I do think the prestige signaling function of academia is somewhat in decline, at least as far as sort of high caliber intellectual. I think there are other sort of there are other forms of signaling that are vaguely coming into being. It'll still take a while, but I think we are kind of groping towards new models for this sort of thing. So
things are definitely changing. They're definitely changing.
Yeah.
I wanted to throw out a few overrated, underrated terms and just get your feedback on them. Be down with that?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So overrated or underrated? Baudrillard.
I would say he went from being overrated to being underrated. And I would say he's definitely underrated today. So, he's somebody I've been quite interested in recently. I think a lot of stuff that he, a lot of his arguments were sort of misunderstood. I mean, part of why he was overrated was that there was a kind of oversimplified version of him that circulated in sort of popular culture. And that, I think what was actually useful and insightful about him was somewhat lost in that reception. And so, what's interesting to me is the way that his thinking was, when he was thinking about simulation and simulacra, right?
Right.
I think a lot of people associated that with VR and, and things like that. And hence it becomes, cited in the Matrix and so on. But I think what people missed was that, the real way that he was thinking about simulation was through things like modeling, right? That that have been extremely significant in the past year and a half, and during COVID, for example, right? That in a way, the whole way that we apprehended the reality of COVID was through modeling, through simulations, in the sense of sort of mathematical models, right?
Right.
Which were essentially substituted in for the reality of the virus, right? And then became the basis of policy making, right? So, I mean, to me, that's a much more useful illustration of what he was thinking about, right?
Definitely.
And because the problem is that the problem is that this kind of modeling becomes very, I mean, and the reason it essentially it does away with the sort of and the reason the matrix or whatever model illustration of Baudrillard isn't quite right is that it still assumes a reality and then a representation.
Right.
But the whole point of this kind of modeling is that it constantly blurs those two things, right? It doesn't allow for those two things to remain distinct. They collapse or sort of implode into each other. And so, yeah, I would say that he, especially since the particular way that simulation functions, in a very immediate, everyday way in all of our lives,
Right.
the way that we're plugged into all these algorithmic systems and so on, that's the part of him that I think is underrated, and that I think he was quite prescient about, in as early as the mid 70s. So
Definitely.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Critical theory, overrated, underrated?
I mean, I think I would say, let's put it this way. I think its causal impact on society is overrated by conservative critics, in the sense that it doesn't. I mean, it goes back to the whole witchcraft thing. It's essentially it's come to function as a kind of scapegoat that can be blamed as a causal agent of misfortune.
Right.
You take all the things you diagnose as wrong with the society, and then you decide that this relatively small group of people were ultimately responsible for it, right? So it becomes a kind of rhetorical scapegoating. And yeah, I mean, I have my own way of trying to describe what its sort of causal, if any, role is in, sort of how things have evolved in academia and beyond. But I won't go into that now. I'll just say that one of my general takes here is that it's overrated as a causal agent of the misfortunes afflicting Western society or whatever.
that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I think that it makes quite a lot of sense that it's definitely become this major scapegoat. It's just like, you hear Ben Shapiro, like, this is the cause of the decline of Western civilization, and this is the end. And it's like, I'm not quite sure that would be it, but it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Let's see. So, how has it been in some ways? I've seen like a lot of your work seems to be creating a parallel academia. How has that experience been? And is that a fair assessment of what you've been working on?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably a bit less ambitious than that, but in theory, that would kind of be the ideal.
Right.
But it's been great in the sense that there's so much more interest in a lot of these ideas out there than I would have anticipated. So,
right. And
also that, it's nice to talk to people who are not kind of plugged into this system of careerism and competition, and who are really just trying to make sense of the world in an open-ended way, and don't really have anything to gain from it. I mean, and personally, I don't actually have much. I mean, I have sort of minor things to gain from it, but at this point, my career, as far as my day job is concerned, is kind of largely detached from whatever enterprises I've been building online. So, so it feels very genuinely truth-seeking and refreshing in that way, because I really don't think much of that is going on in academia, unfortunately.
Right.
So,
which is not good, perhaps.
It's depressing.
Yes. Well, Geoff, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any parting thoughts just about Girard, anything, the things we discussed today? And the second question, where can people find your work?
Sure. Thoughts about Girard. I think I've covered most of it. I mean, I think his, you know, I, I think what I brought up before, when you asked the pre-modern, modern, postmodern question,
Right.
Perhaps that's kind of my, a sort of watch the space point would be, trying to just kind of figure out that relationship between Girard and postmodernism / postmodernity is sort of one of my main interests at the moment, and particularly that issue I brought up of that I think it does imply a kind of reactivation of the scapegoat function in new ways. If we're returning to this kind of blurring of nature and society, right? That what that means is that you have a kind of possibility for, social agents to be blamed for natural disasters and all that kind of stuff, right? And so what that means is that the scapegoating, function is going to be is being reactivated, right? So that's part of what I want to keep thinking about going ahead. And if other people have thoughts about this, I'd be curious to hear them. So that's one of the big projects I want to pursue. So you can look out for my writing at Outsider Theory, outsidertheory.com, as well as the podcast of the same name. You can find the link to that on the website too. If you go to my Twitter bio, my Twitter is at daily_barbarian. If you go to my Twitter bio, you can find a link tree with links to various other things. But those are probably you can follow me there. I've been trying to lay off the Twitter a little bit lately, but take a little summer break from it. Try to be outside more, etc. But yeah, but you can definitely still follow me there. I'm still putting in appearances, and check out the link tree, and it's got some other stray links to other stuff I've been up to. So.
Awesome. Well, Geoff, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, and hope you enjoy the rest of your summer, and just thanks for the invitation.
Definitely.